Good afternoon. Well, we're nice and late, but never mind. I'm sure we'll catch up as we go along. Hopefully you get the presentation coming through. So we're going to cover a short agenda, really, in terms of initially setting the scene. I think is quite important in terms of digital transformation. And then follow on through then and looking at really the people aspects associated with digital transformation. For me, one of the things that I've recognised many times over, and there's a huge concentration, particularly on the technical aspects, systems, processes, supplier selection of the digital provider, but often than not, very little thought goes into at the early stages, and indeed throughout most transformation programs, around the people dimensions. The reason that perhaps I'm interested in that particularly is because my background by PhD is by behavioural science and applied cognitive psychology. So I'm a bit of probably a mixed up individual, probably you would say, because I do procurement as well. For me, looking at this through a slightly different lens is quite important. And obviously, I want to introduce the subject of behavioural science because that's at the heart, really, in a sense, of many of the change and transformation requirements for putting in a successful digital transformation program into an organisation. The most recent one I did was at Rolls-Royce, again across multiple countries, multiple individuals in different territories, different languages, etc. So quite a complex challenge. But at the heart of it too, as well, is thinking about the ethical considerations, particularly when we're looking at people. Often or not, this gets overlooked in the whole melee of putting in a system, but it is really, really important that we consider those aspects associated with ethics, particularly when we're starting to change the way people work, how they work, who they work with, and how their job is impacted as a consequence of doing something like this. Because let's face it, they didn't necessarily sign up to do this when they took the job in the first place. And ensuring what I call that the WIFM factor is in there. So what's in it for me as an individual rather than just purely the organisation. So setting the scene, as I say, there are two lenses to this. There is what I call the technical lens. Those are the hard skills, the technical skills, and then there are people and the change aspects associated with that. Most people refer to them as the soft skills, and that's okay because people understand that and that's the language that's used. But often not, we're talking about the attributes of change, and particularly for me, aspects that relate to the social and behavioural sciences. So one of the things that I found quite interesting was that when you talk to people about a digital transformation, it's interesting when you talk to people about digitisation and digitalisation, there's a bit of confusion about what each of them means. So I actually looked up the different definitions to make sure that we were on track. And what you'll recognise is that, and this will come through as a common theme, you've got this aspect related to the digital application on things that you already do in simple terms, and then the exploitation then as you go through the digitalisation process of what you have within a business. And then finally, digital transformation, which is the whole restructuring really of economics, institutions and societies associated with the digital diffusion across an enterprise. So it's something fundamentally different when we start to talk about digital transformation. There are different definitions of digital transformation. I looked at quite a few of them. I didn't like them, so I made my own. But that's based predominantly on a number of years' worth of experience in looking at this and anchoring it back to some of the other definitions that exist out there, both in academia and in various practitioner papers. But typically, when we look at it and we walk into an organisation, as the saying goes, not all organisations are made equal. So the start point for a digital transformation may well be different. So when we start to look at BAU, in other words, what's the legacy business? How is it operating today? It may have some digital elements, but they're probably quite few and far between. And typically that will just be something that is associated with a pre-existing way of working. You then start to get, when you start to see then pockets of utilization of digital, but it's quite limited across the business. And I think it was interesting when I heard Geraint's talk earlier, when they were talking about moving across into beyond tier 1 and getting into tier 2 and tier 3 and across the business. I think if I've got my numbers right, somewhere between 78 and 81% was the effort that was required then to move beyond simply just working with tier 1. So if you think about this, most organizations probably oscillate around the sort of what I call the formalized or structured approach to digital transformation, which is you've got some change agents in place, you've got some knowledge sharing, etc., but it's really not that advanced. It's only when you get to this really dedicated state of thinking about expertise, models, processes, and really establishing a well-developed and structured way of doing this, not just purely within your own organization, but then across the whole, what I would term as being the value chain, because that's ostensibly where you need to engage the totality of what is across the enterprise, both in terms of stakeholders, budget holders, suppliers, collaborators, and be it the digital providers themselves. It's about engaging that total community that is the really, really difficult bit to get to. And when you look at the statistics, and it's pretty much borne out by, I think, some of the research that's been done. In fact, I think in the presentation that Geraint gave as well just earlier, probably around about 20% or less are in this sort of really innovative, adaptive and agile space. A very different space, but there's a real clamour now towards saying that's where we need to be. Because what we've recognised is, guess what? The world has turned itself upside down and it's very turbulent out there, and there's huge amounts of different dynamics at play, and the reality is it is becoming faster and faster in terms of those incidents that are actually occurring and impacting our supply and value chains. So that led me to thinking about Industry 4.0, and I came back to one of the original thoughts that Gould had around evolution theory, which was, and I'm going to quote, "The structure of evolutionary theory combines enough stability for coherence, but with enough change to keep any keen mind in a perpetual mode of search and challenge." So what you then need to think about then is, because we are in this very aggressive evolutionary period, whereabouts is your organisation relative to that statement? And where are your individuals and your talent that can cope with that perpetual mode of search and challenge? Are you prepared for the people that can actually provide that and provide coherency, direction and leadership in those turbulent times? This would be very much at the centre of a digital transformation, for sure. So the question for me then is, are you going to wait to be disrupted, or are you going to intentionally disrupt your business and your model yourself? Therefore, it's the uncontrolled versus the controlled version of what we do. And the only way you can do that, for me, is an intentional move towards digital transformation. But with that, then goes the whole thinking behind the people skills, thinking about the organizational structure and construct and the journey that you will go through as an organization and with your supply stroke value chain. So not just internally, but so often many digital transformations don't really consider the third parties to this equation until too late. It becomes the point at which, okay, we've worked out what we're going to do, how we're going to do it. We've actually designed the systems. We'll go live in 3 to 6 months' time. Now we'll tell the suppliers. Too late. Too late. And the problem is that with different states of digital maturity in different organizations, the reality is you're setting yourself up for disruption. So thinking about that in terms of the inevitable change piece, what we then have to think about is the top 10 skills, according to the World Economic Forum, were those listed on the screen there. And what you'll see is that if you say, right, okay, my projection is that we're going to move from $1.8 trillion of investment in digital transformation from 2021 to 2025 to 2.8 billion. That's a double-digit compound annual growth rate of spend in digital transformation over the next 4 years. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist to say this is a very, very significant change program that's going to involve lots of people and lots of individuals. The risk for most organizations is that they can concentrate at what we call the absorptive level. In other words, they think about the entire company or entire functions. The whole push behind this is to start thinking about individuals. And that's hard to conceptualize, but is very, very important in terms of them moving to making this a very different way and approach of being more successful towards gaining adoption. One of the fundamental premises of behavioural science is to think about different ways and techniques in which we can engage with a diverse set of people around what we call capability, opportunity and motivation, which is the predicators of behaviour. So when I conceptualised this in terms of procurement, and what I recognised was that the conventional sort of construct, in fact, what is actually still part and parcel of standards, I'll call it structures of academic and professional bodies, teach very much the conventional pieces that is on that sort of, I'll call it map of what a procurement and supply chain professional needs to consider. But on the flip side of that, we've got all the other attributes coming through in terms of social value, cybersecurity, digital transformation, soft skills. These are going to become pretty much inevitables and are going to start to change the dynamics of the role. And I think, as I heard earlier, I think it was in Nick Jenkinson's session, whereby they recognized that asking people to do absolutely everything, being all thing to all people, is just not possible. So therefore, we do have to get to, I'll call it a better differentiation of where we put our skills and our talent to work, but also then what are the common factors in terms of collaboration and communication, etc., to make this more cohesive. So when you look at change management and you think about sort of the way in which digitalization is effectively a change catalyst, and if it's viewed in the positive and rather than focusing on it's just purely about sort of doing some operational tasks more efficiently, but as a driver for innovation and competitive advantage, we can start to think about it in a different lens. We can make it more appealing to people to say, this is not about taking something away from you, but it's actually about giving you the opportunity to do something very different. And so when I started to think about this, the whole premise around this, and many business cases, in fact, are about the level of adoption of a digital platform. Now, one of the things that I recognized through my research was that, and again, I did a recent survey, actually. In fact, I think Scott and some of the others helped me with some of the responses. But the reality is that when you think about a business case, you work it on the basis of saying, we're going to get 100% adoption and utilization of the functionality of the system we put in place. However, the harsh reality is that when you look at that and you look at the survey responses, more than, I think it was 70% to 80% of the survey population that came back said that actually the adoption of the systems was 50% or less. So immediately you've cut the benefits of that system in half straight away. But furthermore, you've disengaged the whole workforce. Huge swathes of the workforce are going, I don't want that, you've not sold it to me. I'm not interested, don't want to use it. So thinking about the way in which we then think about the capabilities and the motivations, the opportunities that we provide for individuals, and how we incentivize them. And that's not always through just pure money. Thinking about people who might want to think about, so how do I develop my career? How do I get new opportunities? How can I work on a different category? How can I get to work in a different area? So start to think about these things in a very, very different way and start to change that culture of collaboration. One of the things I know I heard earlier was about doing more effective collaboration because it's what we recognize that we have to do. But obviously doing it within the, I'll call it the psychological safety net that says it's okay. This is going to be, a bumpy road, and don't worry, they're going to make some mistakes, but we're there to support you as an organization, as a team, and as a leader. Hugely important. So for me, a digital platform is really seen as an enabler to do what we need to do. But in amongst all of that, as we've heard continuously throughout the day, the way I translate all the events and activities. So I think, again, you look at the number of big incidents that people have had to deal with. I think the average was 3+ in terms of significant incidences in the last 12 months. What that effectively translates to is a much bigger, what we call cognitive load. In other words, we're getting people to try and absorb more and more and more information. So that stratification of information is really hard to assimilate. So what we have to recognize is that the systems that we put in place have to be able to sort of do it in such a way that we can deliver to people the things that are really important to them and take away the things that actually they're just running. It's fine. Don't worry about it. It's okay. We have to reduce that cognitive load. And if you think back to, for those old enough in the audience to recognize that as we've progressed over the last few decades, we've gone through to letters. People remember them? Faxes. Then we had emails. And then we had smartphones. And then we had digital platforms. And so that whole journey has taken us from a point of whereby you had probably several days to consider and think about the information that was coming in to a point now whereby it's bang, it's instantaneous. So the cognitive load that we have, aside from I'm worried because I've got relatives in a certain part of the globe, I've got health issues because we've got COVID-19, all that cognitive load is a huge issue that we need to consider when we start to think about digital transformation. And the reality for me, in a sense, is the sort of probably the phrase at the bottom, which is I've got to make sure that it's easy, in other words, frictionless, attractive, social and timely in terms of the way in which I present the digital platform to the organization and the wider supply and value chain. So for me, why behavioral science is relevant is we're solving a complex problem, we're living in times of adversity. Oh, and guess what? We need technology to be more effective and efficient. And we can't assimilate tens and tens of thousands of different pieces of data on spreadsheets and Excel. It's just not possible. It's just not practical. So we need to accept that we can't do that. And in order to do something different, then we have to change by definition. But we have to provide that motivation at an individual level, not just simply an edict that says, go do it. Do it for the organization. That is not a good enough reason for an individual to want to do it. So ultimately, as I said, the importance for me is about adoption of the system rather than pure compliance. Compliance being, I've logged on, I've created a profile, I've assigned all the contracts that are mine to me, and it all looks fine. That's it. That's compliance. What we now need you to do is actually start to work with that stuff and do something quite significant in terms of complex problem solving. So, guess what? It's an eye test. No, it's not. It's okay. We all have 206 and counting cognitive biases, whether we like it or not. I do, everybody does in the world. Fact. And they're all on a scale of 1 to 5. We have what's called the Big 5 personality traits, all on a scale of 1 to 5. And each and every single person in this room, I will guarantee, has a different set of heuristics. Oh, what does that mean? That means different experiences throughout your whole life which you draw upon to make decisions. If you multiply all those different instances of experiences, cognitive biases, and your behavioural traits, I suggest that that number is then tending towards infinity, which is why each and every single individual will not respond or react to information, incentives, communication, or anything else in exactly the same way as the next person. So therefore, you need to understand that at the outset of the change that you're about to embark upon, or the transformation on a digital program. So the behavioural framework that we start to work with is one about understanding then, so what are those systematic biases? You know, how do they sort of affect our human decision making? We all have egos. It's a fact. To a greater or lesser extent, we think about that in terms of ourselves, not the organisation. So when we're going through change, what does this mean for me? How does this affect me as an individual? We have habits, some of which are pretty hard to break. We need to create the appeal, which is how we frame and design to gain positive responses. Constructing that language is hugely important. Deciding whether to use negative language or positive language in very simplistic terms, hugely important in terms of how we engage people. Gut-based decisions, the visceral bit, in a sense, often the fast and intuitive. Now that can be good, but it can also be bad, because we've made a fast decision based on a set of assumptions which may not always be right. Incentives. We all like incentives. So on the more recent transformation that we did, we created a badge system that then linked to an external program and certification for individuals that were portable to them as they moved around the organisation, or indeed outside the organisation. So you provide in the what's in it for me factor. And we're only human. We are all social beings and therefore respond accordingly. And reminders, sometimes we do need a nudge every now and then to say, please do it this way. Don't carry on with the old habits and the old ways. And recognise, particularly in times of cognitive overload, not because people are being difficult, but they will probably need more prompts and more frequent prompts, and sometimes the language constructed differently to move them along that change agenda. It's not because people are being awkward, it's because there's just so much going in, they need reminding sometimes of what we're asking them to do. So the behavioural science piece around change, and I'm not going to go through this in any great detail, but there's a very structured way about thinking about sources of capability, sources of motivation, sources of sort of the whole sort of bringing together that enabling and sort of restricting measures of switching off old systems, enabling new behaviours. So the ethical approach, and again, I'm not going to go through this in any great detail, but it has to be very well thought through right at the beginning. One of the things is to think about, the principle of unified interests, transparency, the detail, and being very explicit and open about that detail, data privacy and security, the ability for people to opt out. One of the things that we did provide in a big digital transformation was to say to people, what we're trying to do is to explore and understand where the system isn't working. So in order to do that, we need to track what you're doing, but in a way so that we can improve the system. You have the right to opt out of that option if you choose to do so. No penalties. 100% of people signed up and said, yeah, that's a good idea, actually. We could see why you might want to do that. It's not Big Brother spying on me, but I understand the reason why you want to do something. So being open and ethical about how you do that is truly important. So as I said before, the what's in it for me factor. Creating a reward and recognition system for the individual, and that might sometimes have to extend out to stakeholders, value chain and or supply chain providers, and those people that are key and intrinsic bodies within each of those organizations, because it's in your interest, in a sense, to get that adoption, to get that information flow, to get that collaboration, that they have an incentive for them to want to make this work. Personalized communication, but it needs to be iterated. It can't just be one-off. Don't just think you can tell somebody once and it's all done. It doesn't work that way. Individual badges, certifications, awards. And obviously adapt some of these things over time. So if somebody comes back to you, and then this is the listening piece, and says, actually, it would be nice if you could do that, or it'd be even better if you could do that, listen, understand, adapt, and modify as you go. Do not make it hard and fixed. So in summary, I did a summary slide, but I suspect we're running out of time for that. But there are so many things to think about in this transformation program, other than just purely about system, processes, guidelines, whatever else. Think about the people, because without the people, you will never, ever, ever get to the adoption and therefore the benefits associated with the digital transformation. That's it. And at that point, I will say to Scott, it's your turn.
Thanks, David. Thanks, David. More great insight there. A couple of quick questions, time permitting, just one eye on the clock here. This is all fascinating, the behavioural science side of things that's often overlooked. From your experience, how many organisations and digital transformations embrace and leverage the benefits of behavioural science?
When I ran a survey recently, it was quite intriguing to say that I think there were less than 20% of organisations actually use behavioural science. But it's even more interesting that 40% said they thought about it but didn't know enough, so therefore couldn't use it. And then the rest, were in the camp of, it's a good idea, but I'm not sure what it is. So it's quite interesting that there's quite a, how can I put it, quite a diverse set of reactions to that.
Okay. Well, what's your opinion of it, though? I mean, should they be embracing it more and leveraging it more?
Well, what I would say is that, and this is not for repeating outside this room, of course, which it will be, but most digital transformations that I've tracked, and most people that record, I'll call it the adoption and the utilization of their digital platforms, is around about the 40% mark, which correlates with the survey that I ran recently. Having used heavily and leaned heavily on behavioural science at a former employer, the adoption rate was 95%, and that's been sustained for more than a year. So I'd like to think that not just having the impact initially, but actually sustaining that then through a period of time, hopefully would prove that actually by taking a different approach and taking a more people-centric lens to digital transformation is a way to go. But I recognise that's in lots of unknown territory for most people.
Okay. We don't have time for questions from the floor, I'm afraid. We're going to have to leave it there. But as ever, David, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just took that off you. Thanks, David. Thank you.